A very good evening to one and all. Father M.J. Lagrange, who wrote a famous commentary on Romans about 100 years ago, described his first approach to this difficult Pauline writing as truly overwhelming. Le premier contact fut écrasant. This is what he actually said. It means the premier contact with this letter is truly overwhelming. It overwhelms the reader by the density and sublimity of the topic with which it deals. The gospel of justification and salvation of the Jew and Gentile alike by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, revealing the uprightness and love of God the Father. In a few words, this is what the letter to the Romans predominantly deals with. The Pauline family owes allegiance and respect to St. Paul. It is said that our beloved founder, James Alberione, considered St. Paul to be the founder and inspirer of the Pauline family. Founder wants to give credit to St. Paul. Of course, our founder is a very humble person. Therefore, he attributes to St. Paul the founding of the Pauline family. We can confidently assume that Blessed Alberione had in-depth knowledge of St. Paul and his letters. Obviously, he wanted all his children to achieve the same. He insisted that all Paulines should familiarize themselves with the letters of Paul, especially the letter to the Romans. In fact, he told the Paulines of his time to learn by heart the letter to the Romans. It is said that Blessed Timothy Jaccardo heeded to the advice of the founder and learned the letter to the Romans by heart. But the idea of learning the letter to the Romans by heart originated from Martin Luther. In his preface to the epistle to the Romans, he wrote, "Every Christian should know the letter to the Romans word for word, by heart, but also that she should occupy himself, herself with it every day, as a daily bread of the soul. We can never read it or ponder over it too much. The more we deal with it, the more precious it becomes and the better it tastes." Martin Luther, preface to the letter to the Romans, written in the year 1522. The importance of the letter to the Romans. The role that Romans has played in the history of Christianity manifests that it is the most important of Pauline writings, if not of the entire New Testament. The impact this letter had on the history of the Christian church is incalculable. It is one of the most beloved and prized possessions of the Christian church. Generation after generations of commentators over the ages have sought to interpret it and make it intelligible for the people of their age. The commentaries on it in books and articles over the centuries make clear the contribution that the study of this letter has made to the history of Christianity. In fact, one can almost write to the history of Christian theology by surveying the ways in which Romans has been interpreted. It has played a central role in the Christian experience of some of the greatest leaders of the church. For example, Saint Augustine in his Confessions relates how a child uttering the words tolle et lege, take and lead, prompted him to turn to Romans 13:14. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify the desires. It is through reading this verse in Romans that Augustine was converted. It is not difficult to understand why Romans has featured so prominently in the history of the church. It is a fullest summary and the most comprehensive exposition of Paul's gospel we have. In studying the letter, people have asked the following questions. What is Paul's gospel? What does it mean to be justified by faith and not by works of the law? Why did Paul spend so much time in Romans talking about Jews and Gentiles? To answer these questions, we begin with a little background. Whenever we study the letters of Paul, it is mandatory that we deal with the date, the place of composition, and also the purpose in writing this letter. There is a scholarly consensus that Paul wrote this letter. There is no dispute about the authorship of Romans. From where did he write and which period of time? Let me read you a small information that Paul gives in this letter. It is in chapter 16, verse 1. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deaconess of the church at Cenchreae, that you may receive her in the Lord Jesus as befits the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you. For she has been a helper of many and of myself as well. What is this information important? It is because it is Phoebe who carried this letter to Rome. And she carried this letter very faithfully and handed it to the Roman Church. That is why we have this letter even today. Because it is very unlikely that Paul kept a copy of it with himself. Now Phoebe was in Corinth in the year 57 and 58 AD. Around that time, Paul also was in Corinth. And Paul has plans to go to Rome and further west towards Spain, because Paul thinks that his missionary work in the eastern Mediterranean area is over and he wants to go to Rome. But curiously, Corinth is very close to Rome. But because of the circumstances, Paul cannot immediately go to Rome. Therefore, he goes back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is much farther than Rome, and Corinth, if we consider, is almost at the center of Rome and to Jerusalem. Paul's going to Jerusalem has also significance for this writing of this letter, because Paul had taken a collection from the churches in Corinth and near about that area for the poor people in Jerusalem. Paul had great immense importance to this collection that he had taken, and he thought that when he goes and delivers that amount of money or whatever resources, that would be accepted. But at the same time, from Paul's experience, he has adversaries. Paul is bit confused about the reception that he will get when he reaches Jerusalem. In fact, wherever Paul went, the adversaries also followed him. When Paul reached Jerusalem, actually the collection was accepted, but it was not in the manner in which Paul expected. The authorities in Rome did not attach so much of importance to it. At least we do not see it in the Acts of the Apostles. They told Paul that he should take part in a purification ritual, so that Paul's adversaries, the Jews who were against him, would be pacified and they will accept Paul. Paul immediately accepted that, and after having completed that purification, these adversaries came, and it was only because of the Roman administration that Paul was saved. The Romans came with their full might on Paul and protected him. And there are others who say that it was God's way of protecting Paul. If Paul was a free man when he reached Jerusalem, his adversaries would not have let him go. They would have overpowered him. And so Paul cannot go to Rome, and he thinks the best thing is to write a letter to the church in Rome, invoking their prayers for his safety and for his future journey to Rome. Because at the moment he says that several attempts he has made and he has not been able. And through the prayers of the church in Rome, an important church at this time, Paul thinks that through God's grace he will be protected and he will be kept safe. In fact, God answered Paul's prayers in manner that Paul never expected. Paul reached Rome, but Paul reached there as a prisoner, safe from the adversaries. Whether Paul had any further mission towards Spain, we shall never know. That will remain always hidden from our knowledge because there is no record of it. Who founded the church in Rome? By Paul's own admission, Paul says that he is not the founder. Paul has not been to Rome, nor has he had no chance to visit it. In this letter to the Romans, Paul says that it is not his intention to preach where somebody else has already preached. He does not want to build on foundations that other people have laid. He wants to explore newer avenues where nobody has gone, and he wants to preach there. That is why he wants to go to Spain, which is on the western edge of Europe. Paul also thinks that Peter is not the founder of the Roman Church, because Peter did not reach Rome before 50 AD. 50 AD, Peter was in Jerusalem to take part in the Jerusalem Council. But there is evidence that Christianity reached in the early 40s or even before. So how did Christianity reach Rome? We identify several factors, because these factors are important in the understanding of the letter to the Romans. First, see, there were Jews present at Jerusalem during the first Pentecost, and many of them accepted Christ and were converted to Christianity. The first Pentecost, we mean. When these Jews returned back to Rome, they started living the faith. They also started preaching it to the Gentile, to the Jewish sympathizers or Gentile sympathizers. So Jewish Christians who went from Jerusalem to Rome started preaching to others. In every synagogue, in every city, there are Gentiles who are sympathizers or God-fearers or proselytes. So initially, the Jewish Christians and these proselytes, God-fearers, formed the community. Eventually, Jews preached to other Jews. The God-fearers or the proselytes preached to other Gentiles, and also Gentiles started coming and joining the Christian fold. It is estimated that in the early 40s, etc., there were about 50,000 Jews in Rome, a considerable number of people there. Then something very important happened in the year AD 49. In the year AD 49 or around that time, Claudius was the emperor in Rome. You see, Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because there were constant disturbances in the Jewish synagogues about a certain person known as Christus. We received this information from the Roman scholar Suetonius. Suetonius says that these riots or these disturbances were a regular feature in Rome, so much so that the Claudius decided to expel both Jews who are Christians and Jews who are opposed to Christ. Both of them were expelled because neither the emperor could not at the time distinguish between Jews who are Christians and Jews who are of their faith. Now, there are others who say that Suetonius could not make out that Christus is actually Christ. He is a secular Roman historian. He did not know that. But there are scholars who identify that Christus is actually Christ, and the disturbances were caused on account of the faith that people professed and those who were against it. So that is why the Jews had to be out of Rome, and Aquila and Priscilla, whom Paul met at Corinth, were actually people who came from Rome. They were not simply Jews, They were actually people who had accepted Christ. And Paul had association with them. And Paul also must have known about the Roman church. When the Jews departed from Rome on account of their expulsion, the church in Rome was purely a Gentile church. So please note that before the departure of the Jews, the church remained a Gentile church for about 4 or 5 years. Why? Because the Emperor Claudius died in the year 54 AD. And the next emperor, Nero, took charge. Nero, when he assumed power, became the emperor, he allowed the Jews to come back to Rome. It is said that Nero, when he began his rule, he was more or less a simple king. It was only later when power entered into his head that he started all those atrocious acts against Christians in Rome. The fire that took place and Nero accusing the Christians, and then the persecution began. But at this period of time, in the year 54 onwards, till Paul wrote the letter, there was no such disturbances in Rome. So the Jews and Jewish Christians started returning back to Rome, because Nero knew that these Christians, these Jews, had business enterprises, and their service to the city of Rome would be invaluable. And so all those who could return to Rome returned. Among them also Aquila, Priscilla, etc. we know. So that is the fourth stage of the composition of the church in Rome. To recollect briefly, initially it was a Jewish church, then it became a Jewish and Gentile church. Thirdly, it was only a Gentile church, and when Jewish Christians returned to Rome, the church consists once again a community of Jews and Gentile Christians. And we know that when the Jews who are a bit conservative, and Gentiles who are free from the law, etc., when they came together, there were disturbances in the community. That is why Paul spent so much time trying to bring about unity and peace among the community in Rome. He wants to encourage both the Jewish Christians and also the Gentile Christians to form one community, and wanting to tell them God cares for all. Finally, in this section, I just mention one more thing. There is one more reason for Paul to write this important letter to the Romans. You see, when Paul was a missionary in Antioch and in the eastern Mediterranean area, Antioch had served as a base for him. Antioch provided logistics and also the finance involved in Paul's missionary journeys. Paul did missionary journeys. He needed a place and a base to which he could return. And after every missionary journey, we know that Paul returned to Antioch, refreshed himself, and began his ministry again. Now, Paul thinks that when he goes to Western Europe, Antioch would be too far a place for him to base himself. So he thinks that Rome would be a base for him, and the Roman church would be able to support and finance his further activities there. just as the Antiochian church did when he was in the eastern side. So the western side, Paul thinks that Rome would be able to provide whatever necessary things, the financial aid, etc. He wants to gain from there. So with all these intentions in mind, Paul writes this all important letter. Letter to the Romans is a very lengthy writing. In fact, it is one letter that has survived from the ancient times, that is so large. It has 16 chapters, and nobody has written such a large and dense letter to anybody. Paul's letter has the primary place in this. After having explored a little bit of background, we now go to the letter to the Romans. Obviously, we cannot cover the entire letter to the Romans. I will see what I can. The initial, at least 4 chapters of the letter to the Romans here, briefly, in the manner in which I am able to do. So let me read this first paragraph of the letter to the Romans that consists of the salutation, and make a few comments on it. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son, who descended from David according to the flesh, and designated Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name to all the nations, among all the nations, including yourself who are called to belong to Jesus Christ, grace, peace, etc. So, you see, Paul has not visited Rome, has not found. Initially, Paul's salutation in other letters are very brief. But in this letter to the Romans, he gives an extraordinarily long section about informing about himself and saluting the community. If you read the original in the Greek, all that I read is one single sentence consisting now of 7 verses. So that is the intensity with which he writes. In his introduction to the letter, Paul identifies in a threefold manner. First of all, he identifies himself as a slave or servant of Christ. Then he mentions his authority. Paul is an apostle. And also he mentions that he is set apart. God has set him apart for the mission to which he has called. Then Paul says that the gospel that he is preaching is not something new. The gospel that Paul preaches has already been there in the plan of God. It has already been announced by the prophets of old. So nothing absolutely new, but it is a continuation of the good news that has already been announced. So that is there. Paul is not bringing anything new, but a fulfillment of what has already been proclaimed. Second, Paul says that his gospel concerns Jesus Christ. The gospel center and focus is the Son of God. Thirdly, Paul proceeds to make several important claims about the person and work of Jesus Christ. In Paul's letters, Paul never mentions about the birth or the infancy of Jesus. But in this letter, he mentions that Jesus descended from David. Does not mention Mary or about the birth that we have in the Gospels, but she says that he was born of the family of David. Paul does not deal here about the suffering or the mission of Jesus, but straight away goes to his resurrection. In the next section, Paul gives thanks to the Romans and mentions that he has been visiting, he has been trying to go there. So his purpose in going to Rome was to sow some spiritual seeds among them, so that the Romans as well as Paul could be mutually encouraged. He also wants obviously to give them some spiritual gifts. So with this, he comes to the important themes of the letter. It is necessary that I once again read it. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for the salvation to everyone who has faith, to Jews first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness God is revealed through faith, for faith, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. So this is the central theme of the letter. Justification through faith. Here he only introduces the theme. This theme will be developed later in chapter 3. So Paul makes it clear that salvation, faith, righteousness or justification are the main themes of this letter. Having spoken about having introduced the main theme of the letter, Paul now goes to explain the situation of humanity before God. That runs from chapter 1 verse 18 to 32. Here Paul explains the situation of human beings without the gospel. Paul accuses both paganism and Judaism for failing to enable people to achieve moral uprightness. Judaism and paganism both have failed. Left to themselves, pagans do not come to acknowledge God and consequently lapsed into moral depravity. Without the gospel, the Jews do not succeed in achieving uprightness before God, despite the advantage they had of possessing the Mosaic law. In both cases, the result is estrangement from God. Therefore, divine wrath is displayed towards both. Such is the human condition without the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, Paul deals a little more elaborately first about the pagans. See what Paul says is that the Gentiles did not have the direct revelation from God. But they have no excuse, Paul says, because they could have understood God from the things that he had created in nature. Observing the order of creation, the Gentiles could have understood God. But they did not turn to God. They did not show allegiance and respect to God. Instead, they turned to creature, which is a rebellion against God. So, creature means idol worship. You see, in the book of wisdom, it is very clearly said that if you turn to idols instead of turning to God, then you are most vulnerable to fall into sins, moral sins, sins against sexuality, etc. Paul here gives a long list of them. And that is coming from their idol worship, abandoning God and going after idols. Paul never mentions that he is actually speaking about the Gentiles in this section. But by a little deeper look at it, we know that Paul is speaking about Gentiles when he speaks that they are worshippers of idols. They do not give respect to God, because later he also speaks about the Jews. So when Paul says that God is angry, he is not attributing to God a capricious and irrational rage. But that does not mean that God does not take a stand in the face of sin and rebellion against him. The good and loving God is not the one who approves sin. The reasons for God's anger are ungodliness and wickedness. So what are ungodliness and wickedness? Ungodliness is a conscious moving away from God after having come to know Him. Wickedness indicates clearly the behavior hostile to God. Truth is the fundamental truth about God, the Creator, Judge, and Redeemer. This has practical consequences in everyone's life. In other words, sin is an assault on God. Let me make it a little more clearer. The Jews came to know God through direct revelation, which is in the scriptures. Gentiles came to know God indirectly through what they observe in the nature. But since the Gentiles do not recognize God through it, they are culpable. They are without excuse because of their refusal to accept God. Consequently, they exchanged the glory of God, of the immortal God, for images leading to idolatry. Therefore, God gave them in the lust of their hearts to impurity, etc. Summing up this section, we can say that the anger of God is revealed against the Gentiles because they refuse to recognize effectively in their lives the invisible God through what is visible. Instead, they went after idols. As punishment, God gave them up to unnatural contact and anti-social vices. This does not mean that every individual Gentile was a moral failure before the coming of Christ. Rather, Paul speaks collectively of the situation of the Gentiles before the coming of Christ. People are abandoned in sin without Christ. In chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 3, verse 20, Paul speaks about the situation of the Jews. What is the situation of the Jews? In this section, Paul asserts that the Jew without Christ is in no better position than the Gentile. What the Jews boast of have no more effective value in view of their salvation. All have sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. Hence, their boast of possessing the law and circumcision do not count for anything. In Romans 2, 1-11, Paul is trying to highlight the truth that God is impartial in his dealings with human beings, whether Jew or Gentile. God does not accord any privileges to the Jews, nor does he give exemption to them from the consequences of sinful acts. God's judgment will fall on those who judge others but do the very same things they disapprove in others. The Jewish claim to a more favorable treatment from God in spite of their wickedness will not come true. God's kindness towards the Jews should not be misunderstood as a special favor. In any case, if God shows favor, it should not be misunderstood as a special favor. It is to lead them to repentance. And if it does not, their unrepentant hearts will earn them God's wrath on the day of judgment. The possession of the law given by God through Moses to the chosen people will not save them from divine anger unless the law is observed. Gifts granted to the Jews in salvation history do not protect them against the universal judgment. By contrast, pagans sometimes manifest a knowledge of some of the precepts of the law because they have been written on their hearts, and their consciences manifest them at times. When, for instance, pagans honor their parents, they do just what the law says, even though they do not have the benefit of the Mosaic Decalogue. Hence, their harmony with that law is quite different from the Jews who have the Mosaic law, but do not obey it. Pagans do them in a natural way because they become a law unto themselves. In the next section, which is verses 12 to 16, Paul shows that knowledge and possession of the Mosaic law are no guarantee against the outpouring divine wrath. In the next section, that is 17 to 24, Paul taunts the proud claims of Jewish superiority. Jews have got the Mosaic law and the circumcision. Paul says that circumcision has value if one observes the law, but it does not make a person a real Jew. Paul then concludes that all human beings, Jews and Gentiles alike, are sinners and subject to divine wrath. So runs Paul's argument at this point of the letter. Indeed, an uncircumcised person who lives to the law's requirement will condemn the circumcised lawbreaker. So, uncircumcised person means the Gentile. When the Gentile person observes the law, he is actually condemning a Jew who has the law and is circumcised but totally breaks the law. Thus, the Jews without Christ is in no way better than the others. Neither the possession of the law nor the marks of circumcision provide him any superiority before God. All have sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. Thus we come to the last section in the chapter 3, which is from verses 21 to 31. Very important pericope or paragraph, because in it Paul gives the summary of his gospel. Verses 21 to 31 make up the first of several important parts of the letter, formulating in effect the essence of Paul's gospel, which is salvation for all human beings through faith in Jesus Christ. Four effects of a Christ event are formulated in these verses, which are justification, redemption, expiation, and divine pardon. It is important to recognize that such effects of the Christ event are appropriated through faith in Jesus Christ, and only through faith. It is the means whereby human beings experience what Christ has done for them. So, we will once again summarize these points in a concise manner. In summary, Paul's thought in this important section is that since all human beings have been under the power of sin and are found guilty, God has made it possible for all to regain their relationship with Him by a believing acceptance of Christ's salvific death on the cross. The only requirement to become beneficiaries of this righteousness of God is faith in Jesus Christ. The revelation of God's righteousness is now totally apart from the law. The universal sinfulness and alienation have been removed by God through Jesus Christ, whom God put forward as expiation by His blood. In a sinful world, the natural outcome of God's righteousness would have been punishment and destruction. But God has devised a means to bring sinful humanity to righteousness, leading to salvation, and it is through the blood shed by the redemptive death of His Son, Jesus Christ. All that humanity needs is to believe in such redemptive work of Jesus Christ. After having explained his thesis in this manner, Paul tries to give a proof for it, what he is arguing. And that is what we have in chapter 4. In chapter 4, Paul brings the example of Abraham and says that Abraham is the father of both the Jewish people as well as the Gentiles. What is the argument of Paul? Paul is saying that God promised to Abraham everything when he was still uncircumcised. So the Mosaic law came later. Still uncircumcised, God called Abraham and promised him. So, Paul argues that Abraham is the father of the Gentiles because the Gentiles do not have the Mosaic law, they are not circumcised. Abraham was called when he was just like the others, and God promised him. And so God's promise is equally valid to the Gentiles as well. Abraham is the example. Abraham is also the father of the Jewish people, obviously, because Abraham later is accepted into the Jewish community, and all those who came after Abraham consider him as their father in faith. The Jews of Paul's time would have looked on Abraham as their forebear. The Jews of Paul's time would have looked on Abraham as their forebear. But Paul says, for Paul, Abraham is the father of us all, who share his faith. With this, the first part of the doctrinal section comes to an end. Justification by faith is the term that concludes the first part or the part A of the doctrinal section that runs from chapter 1 to chapter 4. Briefly now, chapters 5 to 8 deal with life in the Spirit, which is an answer to the problem of sin. In chapters 9 to 11, Paul touched upon the theme of the unbelief of the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and the faithfulness of God and the relationship between Israel and the church. Paul says emphatically that God has not rejected Israel. But still he asks the question, why did the Jews not accept Jesus as their Messiah? And why did they reject him? Paul's answer is that the rejection of Jesus as Messiah is a necessary part of God's salvific plan, which is to bring in also the Gentiles into the Christian fold. God is using the rejection of the Jews in order to bring Gentiles also to the Christian fold. Chapters 12 to 15 deal with the moral life among the believers. These chapters are mostly ethical. They describe the type of moral life that should inevitably result from the believer's saving faith in Christ. Above all, a life which is permeated by love. Love is the fulfilling of the law. Scholars are of the opinion that next to the Sermon on the Mount, these chapters expound best the nature of a Christian life. Chapter 16 is the concluding section of the letter. In this concluding section of the letter, Paul mentions 26 or 27 individuals whom he knows personally, and he greets them. So it is not the fact that Paul is totally unaware of the church in Rome or do not have know people there, but Paul has good number of beneficiaries or people to whom he knows, among whom maybe some of his relatives as well.